Okay, we're in this section in John's Gospel, which really began back in chapter 7. And the situation here is that Jesus had gone to Jerusalem at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which was around October time on our calendar. And he'd had a series of discussions and conversations in the temple there with some of the Jews and some of the people. And the conversations and discussions centered really around the identity of Jesus and his relationship with the Father. And we see that some of the things that Jesus said provoked some of the people, and we see the development of this plot against Jesus, this intention amongst the Jewish leaders to kill him. And so this conversation has developed. And as we saw last week, we finished at chapter 8, verse 30. As Jesus spoke words there in the temple, we were told that there were many who believed in him. But as we shall see this evening, that belief was very short-lived, because those who believed in him are soon going to turn against him. So we're going to have a look at the section this evening, verses 31 to 59, to bring us to the end of this discussion that Jesus is having in the temple there. And we've entitled this section, "Who is your Father?" So begin here in chapter 8. We'll read verses 31 to 38 to begin with. Jesus then said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been in bondage to anyone. How is it that you say you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not continue in the house forever. The Son continues forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your father." Jesus addresses the Jews who had believed in him, referring back there to those in verse 30, who we were told after he'd spoken those earlier words that there were many who had believed in him, but their belief is not very deep. And so Jesus stresses for them the meaning of true discipleship, of what it really means to believe in him and to follow him. So they must continue in his word in order to be truly his disciples. A superficial attraction to Jesus then is not enough. And that initial belief must be developed into an attitude of listening, of learning, of understanding, and obeying the word of Jesus. And all of this is involved in continuing or abiding in his word. So continuing in his word, abiding in his word, is a characteristic of true discipleship. And so to continue in his word would make a person a true disciple. It means then that we must make his word the ruling principle in our lives, the thing that governs our daily lives. So we continue in his word by obeying his word. And Christ's word is the word that he speaks, the word that he teaches is really indistinguishable from Christ himself, because Christ himself is described as being the word. So the word is a person as well as the actual words that Jesus is speaking or teaching. So we have to continue in his teaching, but also continue in our relationship with him as the word. Being a disciple who continues in the word of Jesus then will enable that person to know the truth. As Jesus says here in verse 32, "And you will know the truth." So if you continue in his word, you will know the truth. So it's through Jesus then that we can come to a knowledge of truth, because he is the one who brings truth and he is the source of that truth. John has already spoken of the truth that he brings back in chapter 1 and verse 17, right at the in the opening section of his gospel. He says there, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." And then in John chapter 14 and verse 6 further on, Jesus himself made the claim here, He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. So in that statement there, he includes that he is the truth. I am the way and the truth and the life. And this truth that Jesus brings, that Jesus is the source of, will bring freedom. He says, and the truth will make you free. So what is Jesus talking about here? What is this truth, and what does it set us free from? Well, it's not truth in the general sense of increased knowledge about facts. We can learn a lot of facts about things that are true and a lot of truths that exist in the world, or truths about the world. Rather, Jesus is speaking of a particular type of truth, a spiritual truth, which will set us free from sin, and it will bring us salvation. These people to whom Jesus is speaking, these nominal disciples or superficial believers, do not realize, though, that they need this freedom that Jesus is offering. And they respond to him in a rather an offended manner, which shows their sudden change in attitude towards Jesus. In verse 33, they say, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been in bondage to anyone. How is it that you say you will be made free? They are looking back to their relationship to Abraham as the basis of their relationship with God. And they considered their descent, their physical descent from Abraham, to be something of a supreme privilege. And in saying that they have never been in bondage to anyone, they're not thinking about their political situation or political freedom. Were periods in their past history when they were enslaved or in bondage. They were enslaved in Egypt to the Egyptians. Later, they were enslaved to the Babylonians, taken away into exile by the Babylonians. And currently, at that present moment, they are in subjection to the Romans. So they do not have political freedom. So from a religious or a spiritual point of view, though, they do not consider themselves to be slaves to anyone because of their descent from Abraham and because of the position that they held as God's chosen people. If, as they see it, then that they have never been in bondage to anyone, how then can Jesus speak of them being made free? If they're not slaves, then obviously they don't need to be set free. But Jesus now explains that he's actually talking about slavery to sin. In verse 34, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. So every person who is a sinner is a slave to sin, whether that person realizes it, understands it or not. When he speaks of here of those who commit sin are a slave to sin, he's speaking of habitual behavior, of sin as a way of life. So when we continue in that sort of condition, that habitual behavior, that state of sin, we are held in captivity to sin. Sin becomes our master, and we are not able to free ourselves from the power that it has over us. Paul spoke of slavery to sin in Romans chapter 6. Here in verse 16 of Romans chapter 6, Paul, he's in the whole chapter, he's comparing law with grace and how we are become righteous. He says in verse 16, do you not know that if you yield yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. And then he says to them, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. So it's possible to be freed from that slavery to sin there. And then in verse 20 of Romans 6, he goes on to say, when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. So they were as if they were kept under slavery to sin as their master. But Jesus here in verse 35 in John chapter 8 draws the contrast then between the slave and the son. He says that the slave does not continue in the house forever. The slave may enjoy the privilege of living in his master's house for a time, but not forever. He has no guarantee that he can stay there. He could be dismissed at any moment. He could be sold on to another master, or he could be turned out. So this remark of Jesus here is directed to the Jews who assumed that their descent from Abraham gave them the right to stay in God's house forever, that they were in that privileged position. They assumed they had the rights of a son when in fact they were still slaves. It is the son who has the right to continue forever in the house. Jesus now goes on to say that there is a way for the slaves to get their freedom, and will be through the Son. In verse 36, he says, so if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. The Son, he is the one who can set you free from that. You can't obtain that freedom through your own efforts, but rather it is the Son who will enable that to happen. So Jesus is the Son who can set them free from their bondage to sin. And if he sets them free, he says they will be free indeed. This will be real freedom for them. Some may appear to be free, but they are not actually free. We hear a lot about freedom and people wanting freedom of expression or freedom of movement or freedom of speech. But none of that is real freedom. The real freedom comes through what Jesus is able to offer us. And there are some who are held in prison or in captivity who are actually really free, as Paul himself was when he was held as a prisoner. He may have been in chains, but he himself was free. Jesus acknowledges in verse 37 that the Jews do have a right to claim physical descent from Abraham. He says there, I know that you are descendants of Abraham. That was beyond dispute. That was their descent. But Jesus shows their inconsistency in that they are now seeking to kill him. And the reason why they seek to kill him, he says, is because my word finds no place in you. They have no room in their hearts for his word. And that word will bring them the knowledge of the truth that they need and the knowledge that will set them free from their slavery to sin. But it finds no place in their hearts. So the privileged position that they are in of being descendants from Abraham is no guarantee that they will have a right attitude towards Jesus and towards his word. In verse 38, a contrast is drawn between Jesus and the Jews. Jesus speaks of what he has seen with the Father, and they do what they have heard from their Father. Verse 38, he says, I speak of what I have seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your Father. That's from the Revised Standard Version. There is an alternative translation, which the New Revised Standard follows, which says, I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father. The difference here is that in the Revised Standard Version and I think in the New International Version, there are two fathers. There's the Father that Jesus speaks of as being his Father, of what he has heard or seen from his Father, and the Jews doing what they have heard from their Father. But the alternative in the New Revised Standard Version is just one Father that Jesus is talking about. I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father. So in that case, he's telling them, you should do what I am telling you because I have heard this from the Father. So it's we can't be sure of the correct translation there, the alternatives there. But if we follow the Revised Standard Version, it would mean that they have different fathers, and who their father is determines what they speak and what they do. Jesus' Father is his Father in heaven, but at this point he does not identify who he considers their Father to be, if we're following that translation. Okay, we'll read on here, pick up the discussion at verse 39. So verse 39 to verse 47, it goes on. They answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You do what your father did. They said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded and came forth from God. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. So the conversation continues here then in verse 39, with the Jews repeating their claim to descent from Abraham. They say to Jesus just mentioned the Father in verse 38, and now they respond by saying, Abraham is our father. Jesus responds by saying that if they were Abraham's children, then they would do what Abraham did. Their descent from Abraham would be known by their deeds. In Luke chapter 3 and verse 8, in the ministry of John the Baptist here, John makes this point when he's speaking to the people who've come to him for baptism. He tells them, bear fruits that befit repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. So simply saying, well, Abraham is our father, that doesn't guarantee anything. You have to do what you need to do. You have to do these deeds that Abraham did, as Jesus tells them here. But their deeds show that they are not truly Abraham's children. Physically, they may be descendants of Abraham, but spiritually they are not, because they are not doing the things that Abraham did. They're not following his example of faith. And their deeds are demonstrated here in their plot to kill Jesus. He says to them, but now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. Abraham never did anything like this. Abraham was a man who listened to God, a man who obeyed God. But the Jews have rejected God's word of truth as it's been spoken to them through Jesus. Their behavior then shows that Abraham is not their true father. And Jesus again tells them that they have a different father whom they follow. You do what your father did. The Jews respond to this answer by saying in verse 41 here, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. Why would they say that they were not born of fornication? They may be alluding to Jesus' own birth. Perhaps there was some rumor going around that Jesus' birth was the result of fornication. Well, how do we know whether Joseph was his real father or not? Who was his father? So maybe there was some speculation or rumor about that. And they're suggesting, well, we are better than you. We weren't born of fornication. Or it may be that they're claiming spiritual faithfulness to God. Children of fornication was a phrase used to refer to the worship of idols and to false gods. We see this in Isaiah chapter 57 and verse 3, where adultery or fornication is regarded as unfaithfulness to God. Isaiah 57 verse 3 says, but you, speaking of Judah here and their wicked behavior, but you draw near hither, sons of the sorceress. He refers to them as sons of the sorceress, offspring of the adulterer and the harlot. So there he refers to them, the people who are unfaithful, who are participating in child sacrifice and other things that are mentioned in the following verses, their worship of idols. They're referred to as the offspring of the adulterer, children of fornication and the harlot. And in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits great harlotry by forsaking the Lord. So unfaithfulness to God, going off and worshipping false gods or idols, was regarded as a form of spiritual adultery. So here, when the Jews say we were not born of fornication, it may be that they are claiming spiritual faithfulness, that we are faithful to God. They seem to recognize that Jesus is not talking about their physical descent from Abraham, but rather their spiritual descent. And so they are making this claim, we have one Father, even God. So they're claiming to be faithful to the one Father, their one Father who is God himself. But Jesus responds to this claim by saying, if God really were their Father, then they would love him. They would love Jesus because he has come forth from God, that he has been the one sent into the world by the Father. And the Jews would be able to recognize that if God really were their Father. If they really were in tune with God and what God is doing, they would recognize who Jesus was. And true children of God would love the Son of God. In verse 43, Jesus asks them, why do you not understand what I say? And he answers his own question. He says, it is because you cannot bear to hear my word. The Jews were unable to perceive the truth of the things that Jesus is saying, not because they're unintelligent, but because they lack this spiritual comprehension to be able to understand these things. They have a basic lack of understanding about these matters. They lack that spiritual insight into these truths. Jesus has already denied their claim to have Abraham as their father, and now their claim to have God as their father. In verse 38 and verse 41, he spoke of them having another father and of them doing what their father did. Now in verse 44, he identifies who their real father is. He says, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. So who is their real father? Jesus says, well, the devil is their real father, and their will is set on doing his evil desires. In verse 40, Jesus had said that they were seeking to kill him. They've had this plot to kill Jesus. And in seeking to kill Jesus, they are simply following the actions of their father, the devil, who Jesus says was a murderer from the beginning. It was through the activities of Satan that death entered into this world and the human race became subject to the experience of death. In the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, the writer speaks there of the devil having that power of death. He's speaking here of Christ being the one who shares our nature, our flesh and blood nature, that he partook of the same nature. And he says that through death, he, that's speaking of Christ, might destroy him who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage. So Jesus came into this world to destroy the one who has the power of death. And the writer identifies that one there as the devil. As Jesus says of him here, he was a murderer from the beginning. And John, in his first letter, in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, says of him there, he who commits sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The devil sinned from the beginning. Jesus says he was a murderer from the beginning. So in seeking to kill Jesus, then the Jews are simply following the ways of their father. And also in rejecting the truth which Jesus brought to them, they follow their father because Jesus says he has nothing to do with the truth because there is no truth in him. It is in the nature of the devil or Satan to lie. Jesus says when he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. All lies originate from him. The first lie that's recorded in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 4. It's the words spoken by the serpent to the woman after she has told the serpent that they're allowed to eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but they're not allowed to eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And then the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. And there's the first lie. And the serpent is, of course, expressing there the words of the devil when he says that, you will not die. The devil is behind that lie there. So it is in his nature to lie. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So the actions of the Jews in seeking to kill Jesus and in their rejection of truth, the truth that Jesus brings, reflects their true kinship with the devil, who is their real father. So since the Jews follow the ways of their father, the devil, they do not believe the truth that Jesus speaks to them. And so they are acting consistently with their father's character, like father, like son. We might say in verse 45 there, Jesus says, but because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. That's part of their nature, is not to believe because of who their father is. So Jesus then challenges them to convict him of sin. In verse 46, he says, which of you convicts me of sin? This is an assertion of his own sinlessness, and it's a remarkable challenge. Who would dare to make that challenge to anyone? And the only one who could make such a challenge would be Jesus himself. If they are able to convict Jesus of any sin, then if they're unable to point out any sin in Jesus' life, then why don't they believe in him? So that they have no grounds not to believe in him if he is telling them the truth, if there is no sin in him. Jesus again answers his own question here in verse 47. They do not believe him because, as he's already shown, they are not of God. God is not their father. It is rather those who are of God who hear and accept the word of God. If they were of God, they would have heard and they would have accepted his word. Well, the only response the Jews can make to this now is to insult Jesus. We'll read here verse 48 to the end, to 59. The Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answered, I have not a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he will be the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you claim to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say that he is your God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I said I do not know him, I should be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad. The Jews then said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So the Jews' response to what Jesus is saying is to say, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? We've looked before at the deep hatred and hostility that existed between the Jews and the Samaritans. And so to call Jesus a Samaritan would be a term of insult. Or they may also have seen a similarity between what Jesus is teaching and what the Samaritans taught. And in that case, to accuse him of being a Samaritan is to say that he is a heretic. The Samaritans challenged the Jews' right to claim exclusive descent from Abraham. They also claimed Abraham as their father. There's no other place recorded in the Gospels where Jesus is called a Samaritan. This is the only place. But the charge that he has a demon is found a few times. Back in chapter 7 and verse 20, they said that of him there earlier in this, still in the same context of the temple and these discussions. The people answered, you have a demon, who is seeking to kill you? When Jesus had accused them of plotting against him. And then further on in chapter 10 and verse 20, after Jesus has spoken here, many of them said, he has a demon and he is mad. Why listen to him? So these were common charges that were made against Jesus, that he has a demon. Jesus ignored the charge here that he's a Samaritan, and he simply denies that he has a demon. Rather, he seeks to honor his Father, which of course he would not do that if he really were demon possessed. In contrast to his own desire to honor his Father, Jesus accuses the Jews of failure to honor him. And their insults here show that they have no respect for him. But Jesus gives honor where it is due to the Father. But the Jews do not give honor to the one that they should honor, Jesus, the one sent from the Father. And Jesus continues here by denying that he's making any claim to personal glory. He says, I do not seek my own glory, not seeking any honor for himself or glory for himself, but he says there is one who seeks it, and he will be the judge. The Father is the one who seeks to glorify the Son, and will do that, and he will be the judge of those who fail to honor him. Again, in verse 51, we have Jesus making another of these truly, truly, I say to you statements, and we've seen several of those. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. So those who keep the word of Jesus, that is, those who accept it and obey it and remain in it, will never experience death. Jesus is not speaking of physical death here. He's speaking of that spiritual separation from God. But rather than experiencing that death, they would receive eternal life. They would live eternally. And that ties in with what he said at the beginning here in verses 31 and 32, that continue in my word, and you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Make you free from death, and it will give you life. To the Jews, though, Jesus' words here simply confirmed their belief that he was demon-possessed. They say, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Abraham and the prophets all died, yet Jesus says that by keeping his word, people will avoid death. The Jews are interpreting Jesus' words here in a literal sense of thinking of physical death, dying physically. And as far as they're concerned, it's an absurd claim, and it simply proves that Jesus is demon-possessed. They do not even consider the possibility that what Jesus says is true. So who does Jesus think he is? Does he think that he's someone who can prevent the occurrence of death? Does he think that he's greater than Abraham or the prophets, all of whom have died? Jews understand that Jesus is claiming here some power when he says that he can keep people from death. But not even the greatest of their forefathers, Abraham or the prophets, could prevent death. They died themselves. So who does Jesus think he is? And so they ask him outright, who do you claim to be? Jesus does not give a direct answer to their question. Instead, he speaks again of his glory. He says, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say that he is your God. Jesus will not glorify himself, but the Father will. And it is Jesus' Father whom they claim to be their God, who you say is your God, but Jesus questions their relationship with him. He says, you have not known him. This God that you claim is your Father, you don't really know him at all. They have no relationship with him, but Jesus knows him, and Jesus keeps his word. If Jesus were to say otherwise, that he did not know the Father, then he says he would be lying about that, just as they are liars. But Jesus then returns to Abraham in verse 56. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad. The Jews have made much here of their descent from Abraham, and now Jesus claims that Abraham had rejoiced to see his day. So how did Abraham see Jesus' day? Well, he saw Jesus' day in the promises that God had made to him concerning his descendants. The promises originally given in their first form in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, when God first called Abraham to leave his home, go to the land that God would show him. At this point, his name isn't Abraham, it's Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse, and by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. And that promise was repeated to Abraham a number of other times until the birth of Isaac, and the promise is then passed on to Isaac. So Abraham saw Jesus' day then in these promises that God had made concerning his descendants, that God had promised that Abraham through Isaac and his descendants would be a blessing to all nations. So in prospect or in anticipation, Abraham saw the time when God would bring the Messiah into the world through his descendants, and he rejoiced at that prospect. The writer to Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, where he's been speaking of the faith of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah, he says of them, these all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. They didn't receive what was promised, but they saw it and they greeted it from afar, the writer says there. So Abraham rejoiced, Jesus says, to see his day. But once again, the Jews show their lack of spiritual perception, and they again treat Jesus' words with contempt. In verse 57, they say to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" It would be impossible for a man who's not yet 50 years old at that time to have seen Abraham, who had lived some 2,000 years before. We notice here, though, that the Jews sort of twist what Jesus has said, that the Jews speak of Jesus seeing Abraham as if Jesus had lived in Abraham's time and interacted with Abraham at that time, when in fact Jesus spoke of Abraham seeing his day. But Jesus now comes out with a most profound statement and a most profound claim. They had asked him, "Who do you claim to be?" And now he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And this is really the high point of this chapter, or these two chapters in 7 and 8 here. This is what this discussion in the temple has been leading up to this point. And again, Jesus introduces the saying with that phrase, "Truly, truly, I say to you." That phrase we've seen a number of times, emphasizing the importance of the statement he is about to make. This is something important. Take note of this. Before Abraham was, I am. And here Jesus claims to have pre-existed Abraham, that before Abraham came into existence, Jesus was. Abraham's existence had a beginning point. There was a time when Abraham didn't exist, and then he was born, and he did exist. But what Jesus claims when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," is that his existence has no beginning point, that there never was a time when Jesus, as Son of God, did not exist. So Jesus' existence is not determined by time, not restricted by time. He exists outside of time, and therefore he is greater than Abraham. And this is the significance of his statement here, that before Abraham was, I am. He's claiming this continued, unchanging existence. And in doing this, he's using a phrase, a name that God used of himself, or revealed of himself to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. God has revealed himself to Moses through the burning bush, and God has instructed Moses to go back to Egypt and lead the people out. Moses comes up with all of the excuses why he can't do that. In verse 13, Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" So Jesus is using that same term there when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." The same term that God used of himself in revealing his name to Moses there. So it's clear then that the Jews now understood the significance of Jesus' statement, because in verse 59 we are told that they now took up stones to throw at him. To their ears, this was nothing short than blasphemy, and stoning was the punishment decreed in the law for blasphemy. Leviticus chapter 24 and verse 16. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16 says, "He who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him, the sojourner as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death." So that's why they took stones up to throw at him. They're so angry at Jesus' claim, that they take the law into their own hands. and they're ready to stone Jesus there and then. However, they are prevented from doing so. As we've seen so often, we're told Jesus' hour has not yet come. When they sent people to arrest him, they went away without Jesus because his hour had not yet come. Here, when they take up stones to throw at him, they are not successful. We're told that Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. And that's the end of the discussion. That marks the end of this lengthy discussion that John has recorded here in these two chapters. But this is really a passage that is of great importance for us in our understanding of who Jesus is, what he claimed for himself, what his true identity is. And we see how disturbed and upset the Jews became because of this. They already have the plot in place to kill him, and this is only going to intensify their hostility and their enmity towards Jesus, as they will continue to try to put that plan into operation. So a few things, a few questions for us to think about. We'll take a few moments here to reflect upon these. What will the truth make us free from? Jesus spoke of truth setting us free. What are we set free from by that truth? What does it take to be a disciple of Jesus? What is involved in all of that? And how did the Jews' belief about themselves prevent them from understanding who Jesus was? They made this big claim that Abraham was their father. But how did that prevent them from understanding who Jesus really was? And what things prevent us from understanding Jesus? What might that be? And what does this claim, or does Jesus claim to be, I am, tell us about him? So I'll leave the questions up there for a moment, and if you would like to comment on any of the questions there, or make any other comments or have any questions about what we've looked at this evening, then please feel free to do so.